Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Depression Clinical Trials How Remote Methods Can Deliver Stronger Evidence. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes with a lively roundtable discussion. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel, and that's found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require assistance, please contact me at any time by sending me a message using that chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available to you for future streaming on xtalks.com. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar, and she is Leslie Pascoe. She is the Chief Marketing Officer for Avio Health, where she is leading the charge to increase industry fluency in decentralized clinical trials. And there she is. Hi, Leslie. She
Hi,
previously spent her career, She previously spent her career at Kantar Consulting and Publicis, stewarding purpose-built brands for Fortune 50 consumer health and wellness companies. She also sits on the board of a paradigm-shifting digital health NGO supporting African youth and is a passionate evangelist for digital technologies that can improve health outcomes. So it's now my pleasure to pass the mic over to Leslie.
Thank you, Sonia. Lovely to have you all here. I'm really pleased to be moderating this panel today. This is an important topic. We'll be discussing the challenges and the opportunities to improve clinical trials in depression, leveraging remote and decentralized methods. And before we jump in, I'm just going to say a few words about Avio Health for those of you who may not be familiar with this company. This is an end-to-end virtual research organization. Unique in several ways in that it combines several competencies in order to successfully deliver trials. The first of those is, of course, clinical excellence from a CRO perspective, but also a pioneering technology platform that can run decentralized clinical trials and a virtual site team to actually oversee and conduct those trials. The team has been working since 2017 to optimize every stage and touch point of clinical trial journeys, and to date has completed over 65 trials across different therapeutic areas, including several in the CNS space. So the next thing I'd like to do is to introduce our esteemed panelists. And rather than have me go through a formal introduction, I'm going to ask each of you to come on camera, and then I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, starting with my colleague, Taylor Major, MBA, MPH, and Senior Implementation Project Manager at Avio Health. Over to you, Taylor.
Thanks, Leslie. Welcome everyone who's joining us today. My name's Taylor. I'm joining from Meanjin, Brisbane, here in Australia. I have been in the clinical trial world for about 10 years now. Started bench side in the lab, moved my way through to site, and now I am here at Avio impacting at a larger scale the trials. So I use my experience working at site to work out how we can use digital tools to support our site staff and our participants, particularly in the CNS space.
Great, thank you, Taylor. Okay, next we have Jenny Lee, PhD and Senior Clinical Scientist from Sprim Consultancy. Hi, Jenny. Will you just share a few words about yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny, and I'm joining you from Boston in the United States. And I am a clinical psychologist with a specialization in neuropsychology by training. I have worked in clinical care and academic research setting for 10 years, but in the past 6 years, I've been in the biopharm technology industry, working on the digitalization of clinical trials, optimizing digital or data quality through rater and participant training, providing central monitoring and central rating services, as well as the electronic implementation of clinical outcome assessment. I'm very happy to be here, and I look forward to our exciting discussion today.
Thank you, Jenny. And then last but certainly not least, we have Faith Matcham, PhD, health psychologist and lecturer in clinical psychology at the University of Sussex. Welcome, Faith, and can you give us a little bit about your experience and background as well?
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Faith Matcham. I am a health psychologist and digital mental health researcher based in England. I have nearly 10 years of research experience using different types of digital technologies across a range of different mental health conditions and central nervous system conditions. I'm interested in wearable devices, smartphone sensors, and how we can combine them with electronic outcome reporting to run large-scale clinical studies to help predict outcomes across a range of different conditions.
Thank you. So as you can see here, we have a group of panelists who is very well placed to discuss the conversation that we're going to launch into momentarily. But before we do so, we're only going to run one poll during this session, and we're going to run it right now. So I'm going to turn this back over to Sonia to do the poll.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And yes, so we're going to launch our first and only poll question. And audience members, you should see it appear on your screen. And this is a very simple question. The options are yes or no. Do you personally know someone who has suffered or currently suffers from depression? Now, I'll give you 40 seconds to complete this simple poll question, as this is done in real time. So your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. So please go ahead and click on one of the below. Okay, perfect. That looks like everyone in our audience has voted. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to close the polls and oh, nope, sorry, not everyone. There's a few more people out there that haven't cast their votes. I'll leave it open for a few more seconds. Sorry about that. Okay, that looks like it's the majority of our audience now. Thank you everyone for participating. Now, let's take a look at the results. Wow. Look at that, Jenny. Look at that, everyone.
Okay.
We look at 90% saying yes with 10% saying no. 90% of our audience is saying yes. Wow. What are your thoughts on that, Leslie, Taylor, Jenny, and Faith? Are you surprised about that outcome?
Does anybody want to react to that? No? Well, I'll react first, which is it's even higher than I thought it would be. We knew it was going to be high. We know that there are approximately 280 million people worldwide suffering from depression. We know that on average, 5% of the population suffers from depression, that it's more likely to be women than it is men. And that means that the likelihood that you know someone personally who's suffering from depression would be relatively high, perhaps not as high as this. I'm not a statistician, so we'd have to ask a statistician about whether this is, representative. But we know this is a huge issue, and we know that it is a growing crisis that has come without commensurate increases in treatment, which is why this topic is so incredibly important today. So thank you for that. I'd like to then move on and start the discussion with the panelists with the first question, which has to do about what makes running clinical trials in depression so challenging. And having had a previous session with this group, I know that there are a lot of things, but I'm just going to ask you to perhaps chime in with whatever you think comes first and foremost to mind.
I'll start off first. So one of the biggest challenges to finding new treatments for depression is that the patient population is very heterogeneous. So people with depression have different constellations of symptoms, and the symptom profile varies from patient to patient. But depression is often studied as a single broad disorder, even though there's evidence that there are unique subgroups. And to add more to that, people with depression often have comorbid disorders such as anxiety, substance abuse. This makes it more difficult to develop treatment that targets specific symptoms and to also show a treatment effect in clinical trials. But on the other hand, clinical trial participants should be as representative of the patient population as possible. So recruiting a homogeneous group or subgroup may then lead to a non-representative participant sample. And it's also more difficult to recruit enough participant in a traditional site-based clinical trials in order to study subgroups.
Thank you, Jenny. So difficult to recruit, very heterogeneous population, a lot of different symptoms and issues, and yet if you go too homogeneous, then the risk is that you're not representing a broader population. So how do you arbitrate between those different issues? Other thoughts on the challenges associated with perhaps recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to echo what Jenny said. I think the vast range of symptom experiences that people with depression have make it really, really difficult from a trial design perspective to make a decision that is going to reflect the heterogeneity that you see in clinic, whilst also having a sort of robust protocol. So ideally, you want your participants, comorbidity is the rule, it's not the exception. You want to create a sample that is going to yield findings that are representative of what you'd see in clinic. So moving towards methods of data collection which allow larger volumes of data to be collected from bigger groups of people at reduced burden to the clinical teams, I think is one of the really exciting opportunities in decentralized trials, so that we can, instead of stratifying people out at recruitment, we have more data to run more sophisticated stratifications in our analyses and understand that heterogeneity analytically. So those are my thoughts.
I just wanted to pick up,
yes, please, Taylor, please.
I wanted to pick up what you said there, Faith, about the having that comorbidity aspect. When we think about patients with depression, there are the other comorbidities that they need to, we need to be cognizant of when we're asking them to participate in a clinical trial. It is a big burden on participants to be part of a clinical study. We're asking them to potentially make additional visits to site. We're asking them to, be seen more frequently than they might be seen as part of standard of care. So in order to retain our participants, particularly in this sensitive field of patients with depression, it's really important that we can find ways to keep them on the study and have methods of fighting that sort of patient fatigue in terms of having to continually make trips to site, to talk to lots of different people as part of the study, and long-term keep them engaged and find that feedback while supporting them through their comorbidities and any other social factors they may be experiencing.
Yeah, so difficult to recruit them, and then how, as part of that, I mean, it is very burdensome to participate in some of these trials, and with some of the issues that you're raising, it becomes even more challenging. Any other thoughts around the patient experience?
Well, yeah, retention in trials is an ongoing challenge, isn't it? And how we maintain engagement and enthusiasm and excitement amongst the sort of peaks and troughs of what someone might be going through with their symptoms. I mean, this is a long-term condition that we're talking about. It's on a daily basis, people can feel very different and very capable of different things and able to give different amounts. So the question of retention is really, really important, and finding methods where we can meet those needs where they are in real time, rather than going back to people after the fact and saying, oh, why did you drop out? And finding out then it's because they had a relapse and were not able to get out of bed, or they've couldn't figure out their latest medication or whatever it might be, being able to act in real time has the huge opportunity for us to make tweaks and really cater what we're doing to help them participate more effectively and get more from being in the study.
Just to rebound off of that, it's likely that different patients actually want to interact in different ways, no? I mean, how do you address that issue when there's so much sensitivity?
In the large, so I've been involved in one large-scale depression study where we recruited over 600 people from multiple sites across Europe. And at the very basic element of personalization that we can run is asking people how they prefer to be contacted. And as part of our baseline questionnaire, do they like to be contacted by email, by phone, by text message? A notable number of our participants said that they had phone anxiety, so wouldn't ever speak over the phone, but would give us extremely detailed emails. Some people preferred the sort of very frequent toing and froing that text messages allow. Other people love to talk over the phone because it's a connection made. It's it's a valuable thing for them. So at the very basic, just asking them what kind of contact they want, in what format, and then meeting those needs and meeting that request throughout the study and checking in to see if it changes as well throughout the study, I think can be really, really helpful. And then there are really sophisticated methods of personalization where you sort of use data that they've provided previously to sort of tailor what you might focus a conversation about in a follow-up call. That requires really vast teams of very clever data scientists doing very clever things with stuff. But it is possible, and it's becoming more and more possible when you're scheduling a call with a participant to have the data that they've provided up until that minute in front of you so that you can address it. If they've had a relapse, you can sort of verify that relapse, or if they've had a severe peak in symptoms or their symptoms seem to be doing okay, you can sort of get some contextualized information about what's going on. So it can go from the very, very basic, simple politeness to really sophisticated and exciting ways of personalizing their experiences.
Interesting. So it's a combination of leveraging data and also having real people, human teams that are able to personalize based on that data to create a stronger connection. Is that right, Faith?
Yeah, okay. I think so. And that importance of human connection, the sort of power we have to motivate people to, to be part of something bigger than themselves, I think is really powerful.
And what about you? So far, we're talking about the patient and the difficulty in recruiting them, the difficulty in retaining them. What about the actual data, the evidence? Are there any things that are specific to this indication and this TA around data that we should be considering? And Jenny, you were nodding your head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, Leslie. So one of the other challenges of running clinical trials in depression is data inaccuracy and also losing real-time data. And what we found in many clinical trials that use paper to collect patient-reported outcomes, such as symptom diaries, is that participants may not be completing their diaries or their questionnaires during the time frame described in the protocol. So the parking lot effect, which was famously described and documented by Dr. Stone and his colleagues way back in 2002, where participants would complete their missing diary entries in the parking lot right before their study visit. This means that participants are providing inaccurate data, either due to poor recall, so forgetting symptoms and events that happened days, weeks, and months ago, or that the data that they're providing have a recency bias. So, for example, if participants' symptoms were mild at the time that they're completing their questionnaire, their recall of their symptoms, let's say a week or two ago, may not be as severe as it actually was.
Is there anything that is specific to depression patients? Because the issue of the parking lot syndrome is a general issue for clinical trials. Is there any way in which we think that for depression patients, it might be even worse or different than for the general clinical trial population?
I'll jump in there. Definitely, because, particularly with this disease, with depression, it's a common thing for people to lack motivation, to lack energy. And then if we go and we're asking them to come in to a visit and complete these 5 different questionnaires, they're going to get tired of answering those questions, and they might skip through some, or if there's any negative geared questions, they might not read it thoroughly and just keep going down and going slightly agree, slightly disagree, skipping through just to get through them and be done. Whereas when we're then providing the participant the method of answering those questions on an app, they can do that when it suits them, when they're feeling, when they're feeling safe, when they're feeling comfortable, and when they are of a frame of mind that, right, I can come down and sit, I can dedicate, 10 minutes to this first one, but then I might give myself a break and come back to it. Reducing that questionnaire fatigue where they're going to just start answering whatever answer might be easiest. And as well, it reduces mistakes. Jenny, it's very true what you mentioned about when they think about, oh, what happened 2 weeks ago. They might get that wrong. They might say, oh yeah, it was 10 days ago, but actually it was 14 days ago and it occurred the day after their treatment. We need to really factor in, particularly for safety requirements for different investigational products, that we are capturing when these side effects or symptoms worsen.
Can I just add to that? I love that point so much. I mean, I think, Taylor, 5 questionnaires would be a good day for a lot of depression participants. And there's this huge issue with sort of state-dependent memory, where you're asking someone to recall something and their current state is going to be much more associated with their response than how they felt 2 weeks ago. I mean, if someone asks me how well I slept 2 weeks ago, my answer is going to be way more dependent on last night than it was on some random night 2 weeks ago. So I think I really agree. I think it's a really nice point.
Okay. Any other issues around the challenges that perhaps we haven't raised, but that come to mind for you before we move on? All right. In that case, let's jump to the next question. I know that when I spoke with each of you previously, I got the sense that there are some misperceptions and misunderstandings around depression trials. And so I'd like to dig in a little bit on those misnomers and to ask you, what are the myths that you think are associated with depression patients and depression clinical trials that could use some myth busting, that, we can disavow people of certain assumptions that may not always be true?
Well, I might go first if that's okay, because it sort of follows on from Taylor's last point about the motivation of people with depression. I think there's a bit of a misnomer that people with depression are less likely to be motivated to participate in clinical trials. I think it's, for many people with depression, low motivation to behave proactively can be a core experience, and it's a very common symptom of depression. And I think it also can be quite common for people to feel poorly motivated to participate in a trial, but I think that's because the trial has been poorly designed to meet their needs, right? It's not a failure of them, and it's not it's not a failure based on their depression. It's a failure from the professionals trying to improve the world to not make a trial that meets the needs of the population that they're studying. And if we were running a study in a group of people with a physical condition of any kind that required them to do something that they were physically incapable of doing, that would never go through. And so I don't see why the same is true for people with mental health conditions. It's our responsibility to make study protocols that will motivate and engage people. And my experience is that people with depression are so motivated and committed to supporting research and research and participate so altruistically, knowing that they might not benefit themselves, but understanding that it will benefit their community as a whole. And the studies that some of the studies I've been involved in have had sort of up to 80% retention for 3 years of follow-up, which I think is a testament to the research assistants. But it's just, I think it's such a mistake to assume that poor motivation is down to the participant and not down to the people who have designed the study.
Quite passionate about that. And the 80% results is really impressive. So yes, it is possible. A lot of it has to do with the study design. A lot of it has to do with the research team. Any other myths out there that Taylor, Jenny, or Faith, you'd like to raise?
I want to bring up the myth and of older adults not being comfortable using or accepting digital technologies in clinical trials, and using that as a reason for not including adults in the trials. We have consistent evidence from clinical trials that older adults actually have the same and sometimes even higher completion rates than younger adults when it comes to reporting patient-reported outcome measures done on electronic devices. And also here at SPRIM, we've examined a number of and have a number of internal studies where we examined older adults' attitudes towards use of technology, as well as decentralized trials. We asked them their opinion and their likelihood of having remote telehealth visits, completing study activities from home, using apps on their smartphones to complete questionnaires, as well as using apps to communicate with the study personnel. And what we found really consistently is that older adults are just as likely as their younger counterparts to be interested in participating in decentralized trials and using technology. Now, of course, everyone is different, and going back to what Faith had mentioned about really tailoring to the needs of participants, it's important to be flexible in meeting participants' preferences, and also taking into consideration a hybrid approach. So for example, even though the number of older adults with smartphones have grown significantly in the past 10 years, there may be some participants who don't have smartphones or don't want to use their smartphones in clinical trials. So in those cases, we can provide them with provisioned devices, or for those participants who do want to have site visits versus remote telehealth visits, that we're able to support their needs as well.
Thanks, Jenny. So some optionality, a recognition that patients are different, but you've somewhat busted the boomer myth. Faith has busted the motivation myth. Taylor, I'm going to go over to you and say, are there any outstanding myths you want to bust?
Yeah, so coming back from what Jenny said then about, you know, we have this assumption, particularly us as researchers, sponsors, CROs, we come at this thinking that patients are going to think one way, and then we learn that's actually not a barrier. And privacy is one of those. You know, we hear, and particularly as DCT is becoming more commonplace across, you know, all indications and therapeutic areas, you know, there is that argument of, oh, but is the patient's data going to be safe? But patients are smart. They realize that they carry their smartphone around with them all day, every day, and realistically, we're tracking them always anyway. So by having health data being entered on their phone, they know that typically we actually take more steps to safeguard their data, their health, their whatever information that they're putting into our systems for the decentralized clinical trials. And I think they really trust us in that, because they've gotten to that stage where they, you know, people have heard of HIPAA and the other sort of privacy laws we have around around patients' health data. and they know that we would have to meet that to be allowed to run the trials. So it's really not as much as a barrier as people who aren't involved in the studies seem to think it is.
Yeah, it's funny. There was a report this morning in the news that, I think from the American Psychological Association, saying that parents of kids who are 15 or younger should never be able to use their phones without the parents by their side. And, you know, that's good in theory, but in practice, that's not quite the way the world works. And so ensuring that, at least within the confines of a study with adults or even with adolescents, that we're very careful about data remains very important. But I think, Taylor, you're saying that it is possible to be compliant and careful about that data. And it seems that patients recognize that, and that doesn't appear to be their issue. Great. Okay. And anything else in terms of myth busting before we move to solutions? We always like solutions. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the opportunities to leverage remote and decentralized methods for depression trials. And I think it's just worth highlighting as we jump into this. The assumption here is not that everything is going to be fully decentralized. This has to do with figuring out the right ways to use remote methodologies. And it could very well be, I think, as Jenny was saying, in a situation where you're doing a site-based trial, but some things are remote, et cetera. So what are some of the ways to really benefit from remote technologies? Who wants to jump in first?
I'll jump in first. When you look at some of the questions that we do ask our patients, they are quite sensitive in nature, and participants might not feel comfortable answering those when they know that someone's going to then pick up the piece of paper that they handed over and review it. So it's really increasing that honesty of patients when they're answering. When we are asking them sensitive topics such as, you know, suicidality or other factors that do have this stigma attached to it within the mental health field, when patients are sitting in a clinic and, you know, they might be sitting in a chair in the waiting room next to someone else who's glancing over their shoulder, they're not going to want to answer, you know, some things that they don't want a stranger to be able to see, or to think that, you know, that piece of paper may end up just sitting on someone's desk waiting for it to be entered into a system. So instead, when they're at home in their safe environment, they're by themselves, they're much more likely to give honest answers about those factors.
The reactions?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought about that is that I think the opportunity to provide space for participants to report their experiences is really important. It does bring an element of risk, and it's something that we have been around talking about for a while in my research group, is how to do this in the safest possible way. So we also would deliver a suicidal ideation or a self-harm question via an app. We have all of our safety protocols for what we're going to do. We've got automatic flagging systems set up for when a response comes back that looks like it needs some kind of follow-up. But what we found is that some participants will use different ways to share their symptoms. So in one of our studies, we had a free text box where people could leave feedback about how useful they were finding the app. And this isn't data we were monitoring on a day-to-day basis. It was like nice to have data for future app developments rather than important clinical data that we were referring to on a day-to-day basis. And we found that when we looked in that data after the study had ended, there were some people disclosing that they intended to self-harm via this free text box, and we were horrified. What on earth were we going to do with this information that we didn't know we were receiving? So it's a real, it's a bit of a challenge, and I'm not sure what the solution is, except maybe some really, again, sophisticated like NLP stuff to detect words that are brought up in free text boxes, which we didn't use at the time. But also the breadth of information that people can give us that is not just restricted to symptom tick boxes was also incredible. And everyone was fine in the study, I should say. We did follow up with everyone and everyone was okay and in a care pathway and all was good. But yeah, the breadth of symptoms and experiences that people can tell us about when you allow them a little bit of freedom to report beyond a typical tick box at a time point that you've specified as being important for your research study. It's just really exciting, and we can gather whole new perspectives of what it's like living with this chronic illness through a little bit more flexibility in that way.
So you're getting a lot more honesty, you're getting perhaps more information, but I just want to follow up on the example that you just cited, Faith, because obviously it's quite daunting when you're getting a lot of information that could mean that people are at some risk. Is the assumption that this is like less safe than doing this at clinic?
I don't know. I think I might say something quite controversial. I mean, I don't think so. I don't think it's because people will do things whether they've told you or not. The accuracy between reporting suicidal ideation and actually carrying out the behavior is not a one-to-one 100% connection. You may see someone in clinic who tells you they're absolutely fine, and then they will take themselves out and do something to themselves. And you may see someone who in clinic seems like the world is ending, and then you have a conversation and actually they think things are probably going to be okay. So there's never a one-to-one connection. So I don't think it's more risky. I think we just have to be really thoughtful about how we manage it. And what we do in a lot of our information sheets now is we're very specific about what information we do look at in real time and what information we do not look at in real time, so that it's extremely clear to the participants, if you disclose anything via this channel, we will pick it up and we will do something about it and we will help you. And if you disclose anything via this channel, such as a free text box or a speech task or something that we don't have capacity to monitor, it will not be picked up on. So we've just had to sort of be a bit more flexible in how we design our recruitment procedures and how we talk about the data that we're collecting. And people seem to get it. I mean, it's not a complicated concept for many people. So I think we just have to be a bit more thoughtful, a bit smarter about how we approach things.
Penny, I see you reacting.
Yeah, I also want to echo what Faith had said about it. That decentralized trial not necessarily being more risky. And again, it needs to be taken into account into the design of the study. So, for example, having a plan and how to monitor and also respond appropriately and quickly to when suicidal ideation and behaviors are reported, and that there's a specific protocol in place with responsibilities and plan of action clearly outlined. So for example, who are the study personnel that should be reviewing data from not just self-reported questionnaires, but anywhere that allows for free text or free responses where suicidal ideation and behaviors can be reported. And also adverse events can also be inadvertently reported there as well. And also if there is a report of, or a positive report of SIB, who and how should the participant be contacted, where the participants can find care locally and follow up. Those are just some of the things that need to be put in place before start of the study. And as far as addressing, a common question that there's a risk, especially to depression patients, in decentralized trials, it doesn't necessarily mean less contact. It in many cases actually means more in terms of telehealth visits, check-ins, texts. So a lot of this information is reported outside of the very concrete study visits that just are described in protocol. At the same time, being remote also reduces participant burden, but is also affording a lot more contact with the study personnel.
So in some cases, it sounds like you are agreeing with Faith. In some cases, this could potentially even be safer than a traditional trial. I want to get at one issue directly that we've evoked a little bit, we've skirted around a little bit, but it's the issue. What about the accuracy of the data, the quality of the evidence that you can generate from a decentralized trial? And I'd like to just open that up and ask you a little bit about where are the opportunities to leverage these remote methods to get better data? Who wants to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I can. Sorry, I was just thinking about your questions. I think there's quite an exciting opportunity with decentralized trials to remove the trial from the provision of clinical care. I'm an academic, I work in the public sector in the UK. It's often quite challenging to get an ethics committee to approve a study where the clinical team delivering the therapy or the treatment are the same as the people conducting the trial, because there's seen as a huge conflict of interest. And there's questions about whether a patient will feel pressurized into participating into a study because they are concerned that if they do not participate, their care may be implicated in some way. They may be at pressure to continue participating in a trial and not feel as free to withdraw as we would like them to feel. And there's also a pressure potentially for them to report beneficial effects that they may not be experiencing. It's really difficult to tell someone who's dedicated 6 to 8 weeks of their time to your treatment to say, actually, this isn't really working for me. So we're always looking for ways to sort of separate the research from the clinical practice. And decentralized trials offer a really exciting way to do that. They receive their treatment, we can log that, we can record that, we can measure it and monitor it, but we're not the people delivering it, we're not the people responsible for it. They can pull out of their treatment without affecting the trial, they can pull out of the trial without affecting the treatment. And that clarity is a huge benefit in my mind to reduce bias and improve the quality of participant experience and the data that we're likely to get.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so that's a big one. Other thoughts on the benefits of doing this remotely from an accuracy perspective?
Yeah, so I guess if we think about what the benefits are in terms of the safety that we talked about earlier, where participants are doing that sort of more real-time reporting rather than, waiting until their next visit in 2 weeks, that supports the accuracy of the data as well. We're seeing that as we're capturing those symptoms in real time, we're going to capture correctly the concomitant medication they took rather than them thinking, oh, I took this on one day, I don't know, that'll do. We're getting the data in near real time as it's happening. We're going to see those health status changes. We're going to be able to prompt as well the participants. So if they haven't been completing their daily diary, rather than waiting for them to come in for their next visit, which might be 2-3 weeks away, and then you miss all that data, hey, I noticed you didn't answer your questionnaire yesterday. Can we get that answered today? How can I help you so that we can collect that today, Giving them that encouragement and seeing in real time where the missing data might be and correcting that at the time, rather than when you come down the line, database lock and all of that, and suddenly, oh no, we're missing a whole heap of data. Let's engage with the patient earlier in our apps, in whatever tool we're using for DCT, and get that data in the actual time frame.
Real-time data. Jenny, any other thoughts on the accuracy issue?
Yeah, I wanted to just go back to the point that Faith had made a little bit earlier and add more that one concrete way of separating clinical care participants or clinical care that participants get with that in a clinical trial is the use of central raters or expert central raters, where it's very clear for the participants that there is a separation between study and also the care that they're receiving from their providers. And central raters are also used to increase data quality and increase inter-rater reliability. Having a small number of raters makes it easier to train and also to calibrate their ratings so that they have a high consensus in their scoring. That leads to less rater variability. So really, the use of central raters in depression studies have been documented more than 15 years ago. We know of such advantages such as reduced placebo effect and also reduced baseline inflation scores. So, you know, decentralized trials and the use of central raters really increases data quality and accuracy.
Interesting in all of your responses is that you're talking about technology, but you're actually talking more about people and the way that people are using that technology to be able to drive greater accuracy. It's not like this is just a machine that's going to fix everything. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So since we're on the topic of technology, let's move to the last question, which is really moving forward and thinking about how depression clinical trials are going to be evolving in the future and where you see the biggest opportunities for innovation going forward. What is it that may not necessarily be happening at scale today, but that you think may change the face of clinical trials for depression patients in the future?
I'll go first if that's all right. I sort of said it in my introduction to myself, but I'm so excited about the potential for wearable devices and smartphone sensors. To be able to collect so much information at volume unobtrusively without asking people to do anything other than occasionally charge a device, I think is so exciting. A lot of these things that these devices can currently measure are really transdiagnostic. They're sort of elements of being human that sometimes go awry when you have a condition of some kind or a diagnosis of some kind. So measuring fluctuations in these, collecting so much information, it's like what Taylor was saying, this real-time information, so you don't have to react to something, you could potentially prevent it. If you're giving someone a new drug, to be able to see changes in someone's behavioral patterns and cognitive function as and when they receive it means you can tweak dosages more effectively. You could create different chains of events that might happen much faster and more efficiently than you can when you're collecting an outcome questionnaire once every 3 months or whatever it might be. So for me, it's so exciting. It's got so much potential. I think that's pretty much my career now, just doing that till I die.
Thank you, Faith. Other areas that you want to jump in on for future opportunities?
I just want to add, to and echo Faith's enthusiasm about some of the new innovations that she's describing in terms of wearables and sensors. So working in the biopharm with biopharm sponsors, I see an opportunity for partnership with academic researchers and to incorporate the use of these innovative tools as exploratory endpoints in clinical trials. We know that the biopharm industry is highly regulated, and regulatory agencies such as the FDA and EMA have guidelines in terms of accepted measures to assess efficacy, which are what's considered the standards like the HAM-D, MADRS, CGI, but the inclusion of novel instruments to continue to improve how we can detect treatment efficacy in a clinical trial is very exciting.
So there are, it seems, some hesitations to the idea of using some of these instruments that haven't been validated. But Jenny, you're saying they don't necessarily need to be primary endpoints. They can be exploratory. We continue learning, and
Absolutely.
at some point, you believe that we're going to be able to get meaningful data out of those kind of partnerships or that kind of innovation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think having this partnership is a great way to move forward.
Taylor, did you want to chime in on anything else for the future?
Yeah, I think you could even take a step back from that point about the exploratory endpoints. And, at the top of the hour, we were talking about the comorbidities of depression patients. Potentially, with the access to real world data, we can find these potential exploratory endpoints from data before we even look at the participants. We have these amazing tools now where we can look at patient populations, based on their location, based on, what health services they access, etc. That's where we're going to potentially be able to find those trends, those comorbidities, the different factors that build this heterogeneous population that we can then target for DCTs that are specific to them, that are relevant to how their depression works and what influences their illness. And it also will help us to then recruit at the point of care. So we're going to be able to find, using real world data, we have the potential that we can find where these populations are. We can go, right, this population that we've got this new thing actually is based in, we've got much larger populations in rural communities that are experiencing this specific depression field. Our two psychologists will know better on exactly what that would be. But, we can see their locality, we can target advertisements to then that area. So accessing this whole wealth of data that we have now about the population, and then using that to influence where we run the trials and how we run them.
Yeah, so that's a really nice way to circle up. Thank you for that, because you talked about the difficulties in recruiting and the need for heterogeneity, the risks of homogeneity, but then you need to have a sense of what these different symptoms are and the different populations. And Taylor, you're saying you can increasingly use real world data to make sure that you are having truly representative samples, and then you can do all your studies in Brisbane in the middle of the night. So
Absolutely,
that would
yeah.
be great. All right, so I want to leave a few minutes for questions, and I see one question that's already come in that I'd like to share here. And the question is about participant training. In a fully virtual trial, how difficult is it to train participants to use the technologies and the applications? What are some effective means to train participants to use this technology? And anyone can just chime right in.
Well, in the large depression study I mentioned before, we accidentally became a decentralized study because of COVID. It started off as being in person, and then COVID happened and it became fully decentralized. It was a big shift. And actually, we put a lot of care into our enrollment session. So instead of seeing people in person, we would see them via Zoom or via Teams. And we created training manuals. We had dummy questionnaires that people could fill in on the app, so they could get through every single type of assessment they would need to do with us, so they could talk through any problems. We then would come back to them sort of 3 days later, and when they'd done their first actual assessment, and check in to see if there were any problems. And then it also would come back to that personalization. So we'll be able to look and see if people were missing data, and we call them and say, is it because you intended not to give us data, or is it because the app failed, or did you give us the data and then something happened with data transfer? And then maybe they need a little bit of top-up training. We'd send them we had a training video so that people could use it and refer to it. So we never really had a problem with it. I think it's, as long as you put, it's a bit more time and enrollment, perhaps a bit more effort to create the materials, but then you save that further down the line when you're sort of getting this data without having to travel to somewhere else to get it, or get someone to pay to come in to see you, and you give the people the freedom to like move house in the middle of a study without it mattering and stuff. So I think it's definitely, we've never had a problem with it. It's never been an issue.
That's great, Faith. I want to try to get to one more question about placebo effect and how that can be managed in a clinical trial. Reactions to the issue of placebo effect.
I can take that question. So we know that placebo effect can be as high as 30–40%, and it really reduces the ability to detect a treatment effect. And there's a couple of strategies that we can reduce the placebo effect. And again, going back to the issue of training, right? One is training study personnel, whether it be site personnel or those who are doing DCT virtually, is training so the personnel are aware of and how to mitigate the placebo effect in their interaction with the participant, how to avoid bias when they are conducting semi-structured interviews and collecting clinician-reported outcome data. And the other is also training the participant themselves, helping the participant understand, one, what is the placebo effect and how expectation of improvement in a trial can attribute to that. So really setting what the expectation of a clinical trial is important. And also addressing concerns that some participants, even if they don't voice it, they may feel sort of the pressure to improve in order to feel that not to disappoint their researcher, or even in some cases, if they do have dual roles as their clinician, that it's okay to report accurately on their symptoms, and that won't disappoint them. Their doctors really just want to know the accurate answers. All of those things we found to improve placebo effect quite a bit.
Thanks, Jenny. So I know we're coming up to time and we're going to want to turn this back over to Sonia, but I really want to thank you all so much for your time, for this really lively discussion that I think has touched on a lot of topics. And Sonia, it's back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those questions. We have reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Alveo Health will follow up with you after this presentation. And if you have any further questions, please direct them to the email addresses that you see there on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive of this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now give me a few seconds. I'm going to send you a link in your chat box, and you'll be able to view the recording of this event with that link, and also share this link with your colleagues once they register for the recording as well. And get even more out of today's presentation by downloading the supporting materials that we have available under the Handouts tab, and there's 3 there for you. One is Patient Engagement Handbook, DCTs that deliver stronger evidence, and a CNS white paper. So please go ahead and check it out. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Taylor, Jenny, and Faith, for that very insightful presentation, and of course, Leslie for moderating the lively discussion. So thank you very much, everyone. There they are. Okay. We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Bye for now.